Chapter 2. Recognizing the Emotionally Immature Parent. It can be hard to look at your parents objectively because it might feel like you're betraying them. But that isn't the motive here. In this book, our mission is not to disrespect or betray your parents, but to finally see them objectively. I hope you'll see that the discussions of emotionally immature parents in this book are informed by a deep understanding of the reasons for their limitations. As you'll see, much of their immature, hurtful behavior is unintentional. By viewing these and other aspects of your parents more dispassionately, you can understand things about yourself and your history that you might not have thought about before. Most signs of emotional immaturity are beyond a person's conscious control, and most emotionally immature parents have no awareness of how they've affected their children. We aren't trying to blame these parents, but to understand why they are the way they are. My hope is that any new insights about your parent you gain from listening to this book will have the result of radically increasing your own self-awareness and emotional freedom. Fortunately, as adults, we have the ability and independence to assess whether our parents can really give us the care and understanding we desire. To judge this objectively, it's important to understand not just your parents' superficial behavioral characteristics, but also their underlying emotional framework. Once you understand these deeper traits and learn what to expect from your parents and how to label their behaviors, you're far less likely to be caught unaware by their limitations. Keep in mind that your thoughts about your parents are private. They may never know what you've gotten from this book, nor do they need to. The goal is for you to gain the self-confidence that comes from knowing the truth of your own story. You aren't betraying your parents by seeing them accurately. Thinking about them objectively can't hurt them, but it can help you. As you heard in the previous chapter, emotionally immature parents can have devastating impacts on their children's self-esteem and relationships in adulthood. The effects can range from mild to severe, depending on the parent's level of immaturity. But the net effect is the same. The children feel emotionally unseen and lonely. This erodes their children's sense of their own lovability and can lead to excessive caution about emotional intimacy with others. Exercise. Assessing your parents' emotional immaturity. Human emotional immaturity has been studied for a long time. However, over the years, it has lost ground to an increasing focus on symptoms and clinical diagnosis, using a medical disease model to quantify behaviors as illnesses suitable for insurance reimbursement. But in terms of a deep understanding of people, assessing emotional immaturity is often far more useful, as you're likely to discover when listening to this chapter and by completing this exercise. Go through the following statements and decide if any describe your parent. If you'd like to complete this assessment for more than one parent or step-parent, use the downloadable version of this exercise available at www.newharbinger.com/31700. My parent often overreacted to relatively minor things. My parent didn't express much empathy or emotional awareness. When it came to emotional closeness and feelings, my parent seemed uncomfortable and didn't go there. My parent was often irritated by individual differences or different points of view. When I was growing up, my parent used me as a confidant, but wasn't a confidant for me. My parent often said and did things without thinking about people's feelings. I didn't get much attention or sympathy from my parent, except maybe when I was really sick. My parent was inconsistent, sometimes wise, sometimes unreasonable. If I became upset, my parent either said something superficial and unhelpful or got angry and sarcastic. Conversations mostly centered on my parents' interests. Even polite disagreement could make my parent very defensive. It was deflating to tell my parent about my successes because it didn't seem to matter. Facts and logic were no match for my parents' opinions. My parent wasn't self-reflective and rarely looked at his or her role in a problem. My parent tended to be a black-and-white thinker and unreceptive to new ideas. How many of these statements describe your parent? Since all these items are potential signs of emotional immaturity, checking more than one suggests you very well may have been dealing with an emotionally immature parent. Personality pattern versus temporary emotional regression. There's a difference between a pattern of emotional immaturity and a temporary emotional regression. Anyone can briefly lose emotional control or become impulsive when tired or stressed. And most of us have plenty to cringe about when we look back on certain moments in our lives. However, when a person has a personality pattern of emotional immaturity, certain behaviors show up repeatedly. These behaviors are so automatic and unconscious that people are unaware of doing them. Emotionally immature people don't step back and think about how their behavior impacts others. There's no cringe factor for them, so they seldom apologize or experience regret. Defining maturity. Before we explore emotional immaturity, let's take a look at emotionally mature functioning. Emotional maturity isn't a murky matter of opinion. It has been well and famously studied. Emotional maturity means a person is capable of thinking objectively and conceptually while sustaining deep emotional connection to others. People who are emotionally mature can function independently while also having deep emotional attachments, smoothly incorporating both into their daily life. They are direct about pursuing what they want, yet do so without exploiting other people. They've differentiated from their original family relationships sufficiently to build a life of their own. They have a well-developed sense of self and identity and treasure their closest relationships. Emotionally mature people are comfortable and honest about their own feelings and get along well with other people, thanks to their well-developed empathy, impulse control, and emotional intelligence. They're interested in other people's inner lives and enjoy opening up and sharing with others in an emotionally intimate way. When there's a problem, they deal with others directly to smooth out differences. Emotionally mature people cope with stress in a realistic, forward-looking way, while consciously processing their thoughts and feelings. They can control their emotions when necessary, anticipate the future, adapt to reality, and use empathy and humor to ease difficult situations and strengthen bonds with others. They enjoy being objective and know themselves well enough to admit their weaknesses. Personality traits associated with emotional immaturity. Emotionally immature people, on the other hand, tend to have quite a different set of behavioral, emotional, and mental characteristics. Because these personality characteristics are all interconnected, people who display one are often prone to the others. In the sections that follow, I'll briefly describe various characteristics of emotionally immature people. They are rigid and single-minded. As long as there's a clear path to follow, emotionally immature people can do very well, sometimes reaching high levels of success and prestige. But when it comes to relationships or emotional decisions, their immaturity becomes evident. They are either rigid or impulsive and try to cope with reality by narrowing it down to something manageable. Once they form an opinion, their minds are closed. There's one right answer, and they can become very defensive and humorless when people have other ideas. They have low stress tolerance. Emotionally immature people don't deal with stress well. Their responses are reactive and stereotyped. Instead of assessing the situation and anticipating the future, they use coping mechanisms that deny, distort, or replace reality. They have trouble admitting mistakes and instead discount the facts and blame others. Regulating emotions is difficult for them, and they often overreact. Once they get upset, it's hard for them to calm down, and they expect other people to soothe them by doing what they want. They often seek comfort in intoxicants or medication. They do what feels best. Young children are ruled by feelings, whereas adults consider possible consequences. As we mature, we learn that what feels good isn't always the best thing to do. Among emotionally immature people, however, the childhood instinct to do what feels good never really changes. They make decisions on the basis of what feels best in the moment, and often follow the path of least resistance. If you're a mature person and think before you act, you might find it hard to imagine living by what feels good in the moment. So here's an example of the jaw-dropping behavior of the emotionally immature person. Anna convinced her brother Tom to come with her to talk to their elderly father about going into assisted living. After visiting with their father a bit, the time came to talk seriously. Suddenly, Tom was nowhere to be found. Anna searched the house and then looked out the front window in time to see her brother getting in his car and leaving. Anna was incredulous and wondered how Tom could run out like that. But when you realize that, in that moment, walking out of the house felt much better than staying for a difficult confrontation, it makes sense. They are subjective, not objective. Emotionally immature people assess situations in a subjective way, not objectively. They don't do much dispassionate analysis. When they interpret situations, how they are feeling is more important than what is actually happening. What is true doesn't matter nearly as much as what feels true. Trying to get a subjectively oriented person to be objective about anything is an exercise in futility. Facts, logic, history all fall on deaf ears where the emotionally immature are concerned. They have little respect for differences. Emotionally immature people are annoyed by other people's differing thoughts and opinions, believing everyone should see things their way. The idea that other people are entitled to their own point of view is beyond them. They may be prone to making social gaffes because they don't have enough awareness of other people's individuality to avoid being offensive. They're only comfortable in role-defined relationships where everyone holds the same beliefs. The quieter, nicer ones are the same, but in a quieter, nicer way. They are egocentric. Normal children are egocentric as youngsters, but the self-involvement of emotionally immature adults is more childish than childlike. Unlike children, their egocentrism lacks joy and openness. Emotionally immature people are self-preoccupied in an obsessed way, not with the innocence of a child. Young children are self-centered because they're still commanded by pure instinct. But emotionally immature adults are commanded by anxiety and insecurity, like wounded people who must keep checking their intactness. They live in a perpetual state of insecurity, fearing that they'll be exposed as bad, inadequate, or unlovable. They keep their defenses high so other people can't get close enough to threaten their shaky sense of self-worth. Before you start feeling too sorry for them, keep in mind that their defenses work seamlessly to keep these underlying anxieties below the level of awareness. They would never see themselves as being insecure or defensive. They're self-preoccupied and self-involved. Anxious self-preoccupation is a quality all emotionally immature people share. They're constantly monitoring whether their needs are being met, or whether something has offended them. Their self-esteem rises or falls depending on how others react to them. They can't stand to be criticized, so they minimize their mistakes. Because their self-involvement is all-consuming, other people's feelings are eclipsed by their needs. For instance, after one woman told her mother how much it hurt to hear criticisms of her father, her mother said, "Well, if I couldn't tell you, I wouldn't have anybody to talk to." Terms like self-absorbed and narcissistic make it sound as if these people enjoy thinking about themselves all the time, but they really have no choice in the matter. They have fundamental doubts about their core worth as human beings. They are profoundly self-involved because their development was stunted by anxiety during childhood. In this way, their egocentrism is more like the self-preoccupation of someone with a chronic pain condition, rather than someone who can't get enough of himself or herself. They're self-referential, not self-reflective. Emotionally immature people are highly self-referential, meaning that in any interaction, all roads lead back to them. However, they aren't self-reflective. Their focus on themselves isn't about gaining insight or self-understanding. It's about being the center of attention. As you talk to them, self-referential people will turn whatever you say back to one of their own experiences. An example would be a mother listening to her daughter describe a relationship crisis and using it as a springboard to talk about her own divorce. Another example would be parents who upstage their child's victory with recollections of their own accomplishments. Those who are more socially skilled might listen more politely, but you still won't hold their interest. They may not overtly change the subject, but they won't ask follow-up questions or express curiosity about the details of your experience. They're more likely to bring the conversation to a close with a pleasant comment that effectively ends it, such as, "That's wonderful, dear. I know you had a good time." Because they lack self-reflection, emotionally immature people don't consider their role in a problem. They don't assess their behavior or question their motives. If they caused a problem, they dismiss it by saying they didn't intend to hurt you. After all, you can't blame them for something they didn't mean to do, right? In this way, their egocentric focus remains on their intention, not the impact on you. They like to be the center of attention. Like children, emotionally immature people usually end up being the center of attention. In groups, the most emotionally immature person often dominates the group's time and energy. If other people allow it, all the group's attention will go to that person, and once this happens, it's hard to redirect the group's focus. If anyone else is going to get a chance to be heard, someone will have to force an abrupt transition, something many people aren't willing to do. You may wonder whether these people are just being extroverted. They aren't. The difference is that most extroverts easily follow a change of topic. Because extroverts crave interaction, not just an audience. They're interested and receptive when others participate. Extroverts do like to talk, but not with the purpose of shutting everyone else down. They promote role reversal. Role reversal is a hallmark of emotionally immature parenting. In this case, the parent relates to the child as if the child were the parent, expecting attentiveness and comfort from the child. These parents may reverse roles and expect their child to be their confidant, even for adult matters. Parents who discuss their marriage problems with their children are an example of this kind of reversal. Other times, parents might expect their children to praise them and be happy for them, just as a child might expect from a parent. One woman I worked with, Laura, remembered her father running off with another woman, leaving Laura, then just 8 years old, to cope with her severely depressed mother on her own. One day, Laura's father picked her up in a new convertible, giddy with excitement over his new toy. He expected her to be as thrilled as he was, never considering the contrast between his joyful new life and the gloom Laura lived in with her abandoned mother. Here's another example of a father who expected his daughter to function in an approving, almost parental role, in spite of his past abuse of her. Frida's story. Frida, a woman in her late 30s, had grown up in a household dominated by fear. Her father, Martin, tended to express his emotional immaturity through physical aggression. Although he was an upstanding citizen at work and in public life, at home he slapped his children and beat them with a belt to the point of leaving marks. When Frida finally stood up to him as a teenager, he stopped beating her but he kept it up with her younger sister. He was also verbally demeaning to Frida's mother. Martin was an unpredictable man, sometimes impatient and angry, sometimes generous, happy, and loving, depending on how his day was going. But in general, rather than being a parent to his children, Martin expected them to soothe his feelings, make him the center of attention, and exhibit self-control. In a classic case of role reversal, he demanded their unconditional approval while he indulged his moods like a child. Frida was especially the target of this role reversal, with Martin clearly expecting her to show an almost maternal love and admiration for him. For example, after Frida had moved out to her own townhouse, Martin decided she needed a porch swing, and not just any swing, but one he made himself from heavy lumber. Without asking, he had it delivered to her small deck, where it took up most of the space she had to enjoy sitting outside. It was huge and impossible to move around, which struck Frida as the perfect analogy for how Martin took up all the space in the family. He was as proud of himself as a kid who had just presented his mother with an art project. Fortunately, after understanding her father's immaturity and the dynamics involved in their role reversal, Frida felt free to have the swing removed, restoring her deck to the way she liked it. They have low empathy and are emotionally insensitive. Impaired empathy is a central characteristic of emotionally immature people, as is avoidance of emotional sharing and intimacy. Being out of touch with their own deeper feelings, they're strikingly blind to how they make other people feel. Empathy isn't just a social nicety, like being tactful. It's a necessity for true emotional intimacy. You can't have a deep relationship without it. My favorite definition of empathy comes from infant attachment researchers Klaus and Karen Grossman and Anna Schwann, who described empathy as a sensitive mother's ability to see and to feel states and intentions from the baby's point of view. This definition includes being aware of both emotions and intentions. Beyond just sympathy, it entails correctly reading people's interests and how their will is being directed. The highest form of empathy requires an effort of imagination, which has been called mentalization, meaning the ability to imagine that other people have their own unique minds and thought processes. Developmental psychologists refer to this as having a theory of mind. Acquiring this ability is an important developmental milestone for children. Mentalizing allows you to grasp other people's viewpoints and overall inner experience, because you realize they have a mind of their own, different from yours. Good parents are excellent at empathizing and mentalizing. Their interest in their child's mind makes the child feel seen and understood. It's also an indispensable characteristic for leadership in business, the military, or any situation where understanding and predicting the motives of others is central. Empathy is a bedrock component of emotional intelligence, which is essential to social and occupational success. In his conversations with the Dalai Lama, psychologist Paul Ekman distinguished between different types of empathy and compassion. True empathy involves more than knowing what people feel. It also entails the ability to resonate with those feelings. For example, sociopaths may do an excellent job of reading a person's emotional vulnerabilities, but without the ability to resonate with the other person's feelings, knowledge of those feelings becomes a tool for predation, not connection. This casts light on a curious fact about emotionally immature people. In spite of not resonating empathetically, they are often quite canny when it comes to reading other people's intentions and feelings. However, they don't use their understanding of people to foster emotional intimacy. Instead, their empathy operates at an instinctual or superficially sentimental level. You may feel sized up, but not felt for. Lack of resonant empathy suggests a lack of self-development. For parents to accurately imagine what their children are feeling, they need to have enough self-development to be aware of their own emotions. If they haven't developed their own emotional self-awareness, They can't resonate with how others, including their own children, might feel inside. Why there are so many emotionally immature parents. Many of my clients have shared stories that reflect the emotional immaturity of their parents. For me, this begs the question of what could have caused so much emotional underdevelopment in so many parents. Based on my observations and clinical experience, it seems likely that the parents of many of my clients were emotionally shut down as children. As my clients and I have explored their family histories, they've often recalled evidence of great unhappiness and tension in their parents' early lives. Substance abuse, abandonment, loss, abuse, or traumatic immigration experiences hover in the family background, suggesting an atmosphere of loss, pain, and disconnection. Many people have told me that although they felt discounted or abused, it was nothing compared to the stories their parents told about their own childhood misery. Often the relationship between a client's mother and maternal grandmother was conflictual and unsatisfying, even though that grandmother might have become a nurturing figure for the client. It seems that many of my clients' parents never had a supportive or emotionally intimate connection with their own parents, so they developed tough defenses to survive their own emotional loneliness early in life. It's also important to remember that old-school parenting, the upbringing my clients' parents experienced, was very much about children being seen but not heard. Physical punishment was not only acceptable, it was condoned, even in schools, as the way to make children responsible. For many parents, spare the rod and spoil the child was considered conventional wisdom. They weren't concerned about children's feelings. They saw parenting as being about teaching children how to behave. It wasn't until 1946 that Dr. Benjamin Spock, in the original version of his mega-seller, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, widely popularized the idea that children's feelings and individuality were important factors to consider, in addition to physical care and discipline. In the generations before this shift, parenting tended to focus on obedience as the gold standard of children's development, rather than thinking about supporting children's emotional security and individuality. In the following stories, you can hear about the passed-down effects of this old-school parenting on my clients. Ellie's story. Ellie, the oldest child in a large family, remembered her mother, Trudy, as a generous person, but hard as a rock. Trudy was active at church and in the community, and had a reputation as being kind and helpful. But when it came to empathy for her children's feelings, she was impervious. Ellie had frequent nightmares and depended on a favorite stuffed animal to soothe her. One night, when Ellie was about 11 years old, her mother suddenly took her comforting stuffed animal and said, "I'm giving this away. You're too old for this." When Ellie begged her mother not to, Trudy told her she was being ridiculous. Although Trudy took good care of Ellie physically, she had no feeling for Ellie's emotional attachment to a precious toy. Ellie was also deeply attached to a cat who had been in the family since she was a toddler. One day, when Ellie came home from school, Trudy announced that she had given the cat away because it had messed in the house. Ellie was devastated, but as Trudy told Ellie years later, "We didn't give a damn about your feelings. We just kept a roof over your heads." Sarah's story. Sarah, whose mother was emotionally inhibited and standoffish, had a very strict upbringing. She remembers that her mother always seemed to be holding herself back emotionally, as if behind a great wall. But Sarah cherishes a memory of a morning when her mother stood quietly by her bed, fondly watching Sarah sleep before waking her up. Sarah was already partly awake, but she didn't move so she could enjoy this moment of secret closeness with her mother. Once she was fully awake, the wall went back up, and her mother kept a proper distance. Deeper effects of being emotionally shut down. Of course, emotionally immature parents were once children themselves, and as children, They may have had to shut down many of their deepest feelings in order to be acceptable to their own parents. It's likely that Ellie's and Sarah's mothers also grew up with parental insensitivity toward their feelings. Many emotionally immature people were over-pruned early in life, growing up within a very limited range of acceptability. Their personalities are like stunted bonsai trees, trained to grow in unnatural shapes. Because they had to bend to fit their families, they were unable to develop fluidly into the integrated, natural people they might have become. It may be that many emotionally immature people weren't allowed to explore and express their feelings and thoughts enough to develop a strong sense of self and a mature individual identity. This made it hard for them to know themselves, limiting their ability to engage in emotional intimacy. If you don't have a basic sense of who you are as a person, you can't learn how to emotionally engage with other people at a deep level. This arrested self-development gives rise to additional, deeper personality weaknesses that are common among emotionally immature people, as outlined in this chapter. They are often inconsistent and contradictory. Instead of having a well-integrated sense of who they are, emotionally immature people are more like an amalgam of various borrowed parts, many of which don't go well together. Because they had to shut down important parts of themselves out of fear of their parents' reactions, their personalities formed in isolated clumps, like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit together. This explains their inconsistent reactions, which make them so difficult to understand. Because they probably weren't allowed to express and integrate their emotional experiences in childhood, these people grow up to be emotionally inconsistent adults. Their personalities are weakly structured, and they often express contradictory emotions and behaviors. They step in and out of emotional states, never noticing their inconsistency. When they become parents, these traits create emotional bafflement in their children. One woman described her mother's behavior as chaotic, flip-flopping in ways that made no sense. This inconsistency means that, as parents, emotionally immature people may be either loving or detached, depending on their mood. Their children feel fleeting moments of connection with them, but don't know when or under what conditions their parent might be emotionally available again. This sets up what behavioral psychologists call an intermittent reward situation, meaning that getting a reward for your efforts is possible, but completely unpredictable. This creates a tenacious resolve to keep trying to get the reward, because once in a while these efforts do pay off. In this way, parental inconsistency can be the quality that binds children most closely to their parent, as they keep hoping to get that infrequent and elusive positive response. Growing up with an inconsistent parent is likely to undermine a child's sense of security, keeping the child on edge. Since a parent's response provides a child's emotional compass for self-worth, such children also are likely to believe that their parents' changing moods are somehow their fault. Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth's mother was emotionally unpredictable and kept her guessing. She always felt anxious when approaching her mother. Would her mother push her away, or would she be interested and engaged? Elizabeth told me, I had to read her moods constantly. If she seemed negative, I would keep my distance. But if she was in a good mood, I could talk to her. She had the power to make me happy, and I tried my best to win her approval. As a child, Elizabeth often worried that she had caused her mother's negative mood changes. Feeling responsible, Elizabeth came to the conclusion I must be flawed. Elizabeth wasn't a flawed child, but the only way she could make sense of her mother's moods was to think they resulted from something she did, or worse, something she was. They develop strong defenses that take the place of the self. Instead of learning about themselves and developing a strong, cohesive self in early childhood, emotionally immature people learned that certain feelings were bad and forbidden. They unconsciously developed defenses against experiencing many of their deeper feelings. As a result, Energies that could have gone toward developing a full self were instead devoted to suppressing their natural instincts, resulting in a limited capacity for emotional intimacy. Not realizing the magnitude of their parents' developmental limitations, many children of emotionally immature people think there must be a genuine, fully developed person hiding inside the parent, a real self they could connect to if only their parent would let them. This is especially true if the parent was occasionally affectionate or attentive. As one woman told me, "With my parents, I used to pick the good part of them I liked and pretend that was the real part. I would tell myself that this good part would eventually win out, but it never did take over. I also used to pretend that the hurtful parts of them weren't real. But now I realize it's all real." When people's defenses have become an integral part of their personality, they're as real as scar tissue in the body. It may not have belonged there originally, but once formed, it's enduring. These limitations become a major part of people's personalities. Whether they can ultimately become more authentic and emotionally available depends on their ability to self-reflect. People often wonder whether their parents can ever change. That depends on whether their parents are willing to self-reflect, which is the first step in any change. Unfortunately, if their parents aren't interested in noticing their impacts on others, they have no impetus to look at themselves. Without such self-reflection, there's no way to change. Hannah's story. Hannah had always longed for a more intimate relationship with her stern, hard-working mother. As an adult, on one visit she asked her mother to tell her something about herself that she'd never shared with Hannah before. This caught her mother off guard. First, she looked like a deer in headlights. Then she burst into tears and couldn't speak. Hannah felt that she had simultaneously terrified and overwhelmed her mother with this innocent inquiry. She had unwittingly gone straight through her mother's defenses to a long-hidden place of sorrow, exposing her mother's unmet childhood longing to be heard by someone who was interested in her experience. Hannah's interest and empathy overwhelmed the defenses her mother had developed in response to the lack of that kind of connection. She simply couldn't deal with Hannah's attempt at emotional intimacy. Incomplete development leads to emotional limitations. Despite being highly emotionally reactive, emotionally immature people have a paradoxical relationship with emotions. They're quick to get emotionally aroused, but they're scared of their most authentic feelings. This is to be expected if they were raised in a family milieu that didn't help them deal with their emotions, or that may even have punished them for being upset. The sooner they can avoid their feelings or get over them, the better. They find the world of deep emotions extremely threatening. They fear feelings. As children, many emotionally immature people grew up in homes where they were taught that the spontaneous expression of certain feelings was a shameful breach of family custom. They learned that expressing or even experiencing these deeper feelings could bring shame or punishment, resulting in what psychotherapy researcher Lee McCullough and her colleagues have called affect phobia. Having learned to link their most personal emotions with judgments about being bad, they could no longer stand to acknowledge certain feelings, especially those related to emotional intimacy. As a result, they anxiously sought to inhibit their genuine reactions, developing defensive behaviors instead of experiencing their true feelings and impulses. Affect phobia can lead to an inflexible, narrow personality based on rigid defenses against certain feelings. As adults, these emotionally immature people have an automatic anxiety reaction when it comes to deep emotional connection. Most genuine emotion makes them feel exposed and extremely nervous. Throughout their life, their energy has been devoted to creating a defensive facade that protects them from emotional vulnerability with other people. To avoid dangerous emotional intimacy, they stick to a well-worn life script and resist talking about or processing emotions, including in relationships. As parents, they pass down this fear of vulnerable emotions to their children. In such families, the saying, "I'll give you something to cry about," is a common parental response to an upset child. Many children of emotionally phobic parents develop the fear that if they start crying, they'll never stop, which arises because they were never allowed to find out that crying naturally stops on its own when allowed its full expression. Because they grew up with emotionally phobic parents who stepped in to squelch their distress, they never experienced the natural rhythm of a crying episode and how it winds down. It's easy to see how children growing up under these conditions could become fearful of their own emotions. In fact, even positive feelings of joy and excitement can become associated with anxiety. For example, Anthony recalled a painful incident when he joyfully raced out the front door to greet his father as he pulled up in the driveway. Anthony leaped over a small bush, swiped it with his foot, and knocked it over. Instead of appreciating Anthony's display of affection, his father gave him a beating. As a result, Anthony learned not only to be afraid of his father, but to fear spontaneous joy as something that would get him in trouble. They focus on the physical instead of the emotional. Emotionally immature parents can do a good job of taking care of their children's physical and material needs. In the world of food, shelter, and education, these parents may be able to provide everything that's needed. In terms of things that are physical, tangible, or activity-related, many of these parents make sure their children get every advantage they can afford. But when it comes to emotional matters, they can be oblivious to their children's needs. Many of my clients have good memories of being well cared for when ill, enjoying their parents' attention, and even receiving presents and favorite foods. But this happened only after their parents were duly convinced they were really sick. They experienced this attentiveness when they were sick as proof of their parents' love. It seemed to be the one time when they remembered receiving lots of attention. This makes sense, because caretaking during illness would allow a parent the justification to indulge a child with attention and affection. It stands to reason that affectionate caretaking felt safe to these parents when done for the purpose of restoring the child's physical health. Physical aid was more sanctioned than emotional attachment. Being well cared for in non-emotional areas can create confusion in people who grow up feeling emotionally lonely. They have overwhelming physical evidence that their parents loved and sacrificed for them, but they feel a painful lack of emotional security and closeness with their parents. They can be killjoys. Fear of genuine emotion can cause emotionally immature people to be killjoys. As parents, instead of enjoying their children's excitement and enthusiasm, they may abruptly change the subject or warn them not to get their hopes up. In response to their children's exuberance, they're likely to say something dismissive or skeptical to bring it down a notch. When one woman told her mother about her excitement about buying her first house, her mother actually said, "Yes, and then you'll find something else to go on about." They have intense but shallow emotions. Emotionally immature people are easily overwhelmed by deep emotion, and they display their uneasiness by transmuting it into quick reactivity. Instead of feeling things deeply, they react superficially. They may be emotionally excitable and show a strong sentimentality, perhaps being easily moved to tears. Or they may puff up in anger toward anything they dislike. Their reactivity may seem to indicate that they're passionate and deeply emotional, but their emotional expression often has a glancing quality, almost like a stone skipping the surface rather than going into the depths. It's a fleeting reaction of the moment, dramatic but not deep. When interacting with such people, the weirdly shallow quality of their emotions may leave you feeling unmoved by their distress. You might tell yourself that you should be feeling more for them, but your heart can't resonate with their exaggerated reactions. And because they overreact so frequently, you may quickly learn to tune them out for the sake of your own emotional survival. They don't experience mixed emotions. The ability to feel mixed emotions is a sign of maturity. If people can blend contradictory emotions together, such as happiness with guilt or anger with love, it shows that they can encompass life's emotional complexity. Experienced together, opposing feelings tame each other. Once people develop the ability to feel different emotions at the same time, the world ripens into something richer and deeper. Instead of having a single, intense, one-dimensional emotional reaction, they can experience several different feelings that reflect the nuances of the situation. However, the reactions of emotionally immature people tend to be black and white, with no gray areas. This rules out ambivalence, dilemmas, and other emotionally complicated experiences. Differences in quality of thought. In addition to emotional and behavioral differences, there are often intellectual differences between emotionally mature and immature people. If your parents grew up in a family atmosphere that was full of anxiety and judgment, they may have learned to think narrowly and resist complexity. Excessive childhood anxiety leads not only to emotional immaturity, but also to oversimplified thinking that cannot hold opposing ideas in mind. Repressive or punitive family environments typically don't encourage free thinking or self-expression, and therefore aren't conducive to fully developing one's mind. Difficulties with conceptual thinking. Starting in adolescence, children begin to think conceptually, enabling them to solve problems with logic and reasoning instead of knee-jerk impulses. Accelerated brain development means they become more objective and more imaginative. They can group ideas into categories and quickly think in symbols. They go beyond simply memorizing things and start to evaluate ideas, not just compare facts. They are able to think independently and hypothetically, and to generate new insights from previous knowledge. As children enter their teen years, their ability to self-reflect skyrockets because they become able to think about their own thinking. However, the intense emotions and anxiety that emotionally immature people experience can decrease their ability to think at this higher level. Since they are often at the mercy of their emotions, their higher thinking can easily fall apart under stress. In fact, their frequent lack of self-reflection comes from this tendency to regress and temporarily lose their ability to think about their thinking. When emotion-inducing topics come up, their minds fall into rigid black or white thinking that rejects complexity and precludes any cross-pollination of ideas. Emotionally immature people who are otherwise intelligent can think conceptually and show insight as long as they don't feel too threatened in the moment. Their intellectual objectivity is limited to topics that aren't emotionally arousing to them. This can be puzzling to their children, who experience two very different sides to their parents, sometimes intelligent and insightful, other times narrow-minded and impossible to reason with. Proneness to literal thinking. If you listen to the conversations of emotionally immature people, you may notice how routine and literal their thinking is. They tend to talk about what happened or what they observed, not the world of feelings or ideas. For example, one man found his mother's phone conversations draining and boring because she never talked about anything substantive. Instead, she only asked him mundane questions, like what he was doing at the moment or what the weather was like. He told me, "She just reports the facts and never talks about anything other than, here's what's happened lately. She doesn't connect with me in conversation. I get so frustrated and I want to say, can't we talk about something meaningful? But she can't." Intellectualizing obsessively. Another cognitive sign of emotional immaturity is over-intellectualizing and getting obsessed about certain topics. In those areas, emotionally immature people can conceptualize well, indeed excessively, but they don't apply that ability to self-reflection or being emotionally sensitive toward others. Their preoccupation with ideas distracts them from emotional intimacy. They may discuss their favorite topics at length, but they don't really engage with other people. As a result, They can be as hard to talk to as overly literal thinkers. Although they can think conceptually while communicating their ideas, they're only comfortable if things stay on an impersonal and intellectual level. Summary. Emotional immaturity is a real phenomenon that has been studied and written about for a long time. It undermines people's ability to deal with stress and to be emotionally intimate with others. Emotionally immature people often grew up in a family environment that curtailed their full emotional and intellectual development. As a result, they have an oversimplified approach to life, narrowing situations down to fit their rigid coping skills. Having such a limited sense of self makes them egocentric and undermines their ability to be sensitive to other people's needs and feelings. Their reactive emotions, lack of objectivity, and fear of emotional intimacy can make close relationships difficult, especially when it comes to their children. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at what it feels like to have a relationship with an emotionally immature parent, along with the challenges adult children face in trying to communicate with such parents.